Hello, once again. This is Marshall Sanders. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you who are listening to me today. We are finally mostly here. I am now going to identify the victims of the white matrix in America. And I'm going to start first with those who many times do not believe that they are victims also of the white matrix. But not only that, but so that they understand that this is not a black or white issue. It is equally important that whites, blacks, and others help to tear down this white matrix. You see, the white matrix did benefit some for a while, but make no mistake, the white matrix or manta of matrix is to victimize everyone who is not its leaders and its procrastinators. So, rather than start in on the people of color who are victims, I'm going to acknowledge the victims who were not people of color so that those who still are so deep in the white matrix, they think that this is about them. Well, let's talk about you. So, on the list of those who are due reparations, the first are the abolitionists. Now, the abolitionists, of course, were those who were opposing slavery in America for as far back as it started in America. There were many forms of slavery, and not all slavery is alike. For instance, we know that young kids from England as well as from Ireland were predominantly slaves when 1609 had started. The black slave was more of a luxury, if you will, and only beginning to really start to be a priority later. But of course, there were the Quakers, and there were others who had a conscience, mostly Christian conscience, who did not believe that any person should be a slave to another person. Now, while many accepted that you could be a servant, and even an indentured servant, the distinction of being an indentured servant and a slave, as we see it in our minds, was very distinct in their minds. Rape, murder, chaining up a human being was not what they dubbed slavery. However, it is what we have in our minds. So I'm going to do my best to make distinctions, just as they make a distinction between murder 1, 2, and 3, as manslaughter 1, 2, and 3, which all lead to the death of a person. However, the details are in the details that we need to be sure we have the evidence to support it. So the abolitionists, those who fought on the side of those who were oppressed by the white matrix and enslaved in that system, well, they lost their lives, they lost their property, they lost relationships. And if you think that's only for them, you're going to hear a reoccurring theme for every one of the next victims that I spoke of. You even have some that lost their, how should I say, inclusion of being decent states in the sight of so many others. Why? Because about time 1797 had rolled around, in their state laws, they had already abolished slavery in one form or other in their country, in their state, rather. So, I'm going to mention these states in part for their, how should I say, ability to come to themselves. Notice that the white matrix was not a benefit to them or their people, and decided to come out of the white matrix. Amongst those are Vermont, Rhode Island, Maine, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. So these states by 1797 had already seen that the form of slavery that existed in the South, let's call it slavery first class, murder, should no longer exist in their state. However, people have an idea that slavery existed only in the South. You would be very much incorrect. You see, slavery in the South were mostly farms, or pretty much exclusively farms and agriculture. And those agriculture and farms, roughly the same field, were mostly in the states that were the southern states because of the great land and weather and soil, of course. Maryland being one of the, if not the richest state during the time of slavery, a state in which I now reside in and have resided in my entire life. But in the North, there were textile businesses. It required much more intellect and trained, skilled labor. However, that's not to be distinguished to say that there was no slavery in the textile industry. It simply was more slavery, manslaughter, if you will. So, but we're talking about the victims, so I digress. The biggest victims of slavery that were not people of color were the Quakers, and they remain the biggest victims outside of the actual black slave. The Quakers are those whom much, much reparation is due. Why? Because they not only took care of things that are slavery issues, they took care of human rights issues. Did you know that the Quakers, though they refused to pick up arms to fight in the wars, that even their enemies on a battlefield, they would go to war without a weapon to actually bandage and feed and care for the wounded on all sides of the war. You have people who were enemy combatants that several years later, even generations later, would recognize the badge of the Quaker and tell testimonies like, if it were not for you, I would have never been born because my dad was an enemy combatant and you fed them and you clothed them and you nursed them back to health. And because of you, I was born when my dad recovered. The Quakers. But let's move on. The so-called po white trash of society. I say so-called because I certainly do not call them that. But the descendants of so much of the hard work that was not done by the colored slaves was done by descendants of those who remained indentured servants. They also were descendants of many who came to this country also being persecuted for their Christianity and other things, and were not given the opportunity of many, pretty much all whites, because they sided with those who said that every man is created equal. Therefore, being ostracized from their own society, many of them lived in poverty and do live into poverty even to this day. It is out of them that the same victims also came out of, that they derogatorily called hippies, because those hippies had moved and had been in the presence of so many people of color for so long, and yet some had gained some economic freedom and some have not, being called the lowest of white society because of their inability to be economically viable in this country. And so, under Nixon, he found the two most repulsive of people were the Negro voters and these hippies. So when you think reparations, think hippies. Another big, and I should say one of the final ones on my list anyway, are ones whom you call, wait for it, liberals. Well, Marshall, I thought this was not a political discussion. And how dare you say that liberals deserve reparations? I'm glad you asked. Because the definition of liberals has been changed and altered and diminished for such a long time. Many, if not even most of you, have zero idea what I mean by a liberal. In your 21st century minds of brainwashing from media, you believe and you've labeled media a liberal to be someone who's of the Democratic Party. Or maybe it's their progressive politics and some other things. Those, ladies and gentlemen, are not liberals. What are liberals? Well, they most certainly aren't Democrat. Oh, and they're most certainly not Republican. Liberals, as it implies, are those who stand for liberty. And first of all, they themselves are free or liberal, and they call for the same to be established to all people to be liberal or to have and dwell in liberty. And yet, just for having that stance, people like Quakers and such others, who were of many and all races, whether it was a Japanese or whether it was a Chinese or whether it was an Asian, Southern Asian, whether it was any other religion or religious person or even non-religious person. These liberals coined a phrase of live and let live. And yet, because they said live and let live, they themselves were subjected to bondage, and they finally also deserve reparations. So, what of those liberals who are called liberals today who choose to be members of the white matrix? Well, certainly any and all victims inside of the white matrix. Victims of their own minds, victims of their own souls, victims of their own physicality, their economic and financial abilities. Yes, that is true. But it's a chosen thing for them to be victims of those things. And so that is why we are here, however. Because when you say reparations, you're saying to repair something. And you want to repair something because it is not whole or working as it was intended to work. And so today, we are going to try to repair the white society as much as we are the black society, as much as we are the Chinese society, as much as we are the Japanese society, as much as we are all societies that exist inside of America. So, I've reviewed today in this video the white victims of the white matrix today. Next, we're going to deal with many, and hopefully I can deal with all of the black victims, because I want to get as soon as possible into the victims and also the solutions and the various solutions to the problems. Because the U.S. mentality is, whenever we see a problem, is generally to throw money at it. So is there any wonder that the citizens of this country also think that everything is about money? Well, I'm here to tell you that the reparations in which I speak of are not entirely, and maybe even not even majorly, about money at all. But it is definitely about repairing. And in some cases, it's about completely, 100%, utterly destroying. Because here is the thing: an evil person builds evil. And even if the evil person tears it down, an evil person will still rebuild. And so the whole structure of it is evil. But a good person builds a good and can tear down a good. And at the end of the day, you would say, as long as a good person builds. Well, I'm here to tell you that even if the good does not decide to tear down, but the not good, the evil even, tears down structure, the good man, if he so chooses, can rebuild the good. What I'm saying to you is that something very simple. People are running around saying that the protesters, the so-called protesters, are made up of Antifa and such other paid protesters and rioters and such other things, saying, how dare they tear down our good? But I'm sure that I've demonstrated with proof that the system in which you have in place is not, nor has it ever been good. It has been the white matrix from the beginning, the illusion of good. And so this bad structure built by bad people needs to be torn down. And the fear rises in the people who are in the white matrix to say, this is being torn down. What should we do? We should resist these evil people from tearing it down. But here's the good thing about this. If you come out of the white matrix, you will stop resisting the bad and the good from tearing down the white matrix. The only question is, when it's torn down, are you going to allow the evil to rebuild and make a worse system? Or are we going to remove the evil from building at all and finally allow the good to build the good? It is a question I pose to you. As you think of reparations, as you think of what I just spoke to you about, the victims who were not people of color, at least not yet, in this video. I will make another video soon. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you and yours.